The city was a monster of concrete and glass, its heartbeat a distant, indifferent hum. For Clara Evans, it was a cold, hard bed. At 24 years old and 8 months pregnant, the world had shrunk to the size of the cardboard she slept on, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Each gust of wind felt like a personal attack, slicing through her thin coat and reminding her of the warmth she no longer had. People flowed around her like a river around a stone, their faces a blur of haste and dismissal. They didn't see the curve of her belly beneath the worn fabric, or the tremor in her hands as she clutched the only thing of value she owned, a tiny, crumpled ultrasound photo. It was a ghost of a promise, a fragile dream in a world that had become a waking nightmare. Her body was a battlefield of aches. A dull, constant pain radiated from her lower back, a consequence of carrying a life while having no place to rest her own. Her ankles were swollen, her feet sore from endless walking in search of a safe corner, a kind face, a morsel of charity, but the physical pain was a dull echo compared to the sharp terror that lived in her heart. It wasn't for herself. Hunger was an old, familiar enemy. The real fear was for the tiny, innocent life stirring within her. Every kick, every flutter was both a miracle and a condemnation. It was a reminder of her profound failure as a mother before she had even had the chance to begin, a silent accusation that she had brought a child into a world that had no room for them. She remembered the finality in her partner's voice, the words, "It's not my problem," hanging in the air long after he had walked away. Then came the job, a cleaning position lost to the fatigue and complications of a high-risk pregnancy. Her meager savings evaporated like mist. Family was a locked door she no longer had the key for. Now, her only companions were the shadows that grew longer as the sun set. She watched families pass by, their laughter a sound from another universe. A father lifted his child onto his shoulders, and Clara had to look away, a wave of grief so powerful it almost knocked the air from her lungs. She was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she was no longer a part of. In the quiet moments, when the city's roar subsided to a low growl, she would talk to her baby. Her whispers were lost to the wind, a secret conversation between two souls against the world. "I'm here," she would murmur, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "Mommy's here, I'll find a way, I promise." But the promise felt like a lie, each word heavier than the last. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting against the crushing certainty that she had nothing to offer her child but a legacy of cold, hunger, and loneliness. It was a terror that hollowed her out from the inside. That evening, a different kind of hunger took hold. It wasn't for food. It was the desperate, primal urge of a mother preparing her nest. Through the gleaming window of an upscale grocery store, she saw a display of baby formula and diapers, impossibly clean and perfect. They were symbols of a world of care and safety she couldn't provide. The sight broke something inside her. The gnawing fear transformed into a reckless, singular focus. The world narrowed to that can of formula, to that package of diapers. It was no longer about her, it was about her child. It was about one small act of preparation, one tiny piece of normalcy in an existence that was anything but. The cold logic of survival was replaced by the fierce, irrational love of a mother. The automatic doors of the upscale market slid open with a gentle whoosh, releasing a gust of warm, cinnamon-scented air. It was another world, a universe away from the biting wind she had just escaped. Clara moved like a phantom through the aisles, a ghost haunting a palace of abundance. Her eyes slid past the mountains of vibrant fruit, the artisanal cheeses, the towers of imported chocolate. They were objects from a life she no longer recognized. Her gaze was fixed, locked on a beacon of pastel blue and yellow at the far end of the store. Aisle 7, Baby Care. Each step was a war against the screaming voice in her head that told her she didn't belong, that she was a stain on this pristine environment. But a deeper, primal instinct pushed her forward, silencing all fear. Her hand, chapped and trembling, reached for a can of formula. It felt impossibly heavy in her palm, a talisman of both hope and transgression. The plastic crinkle of the newborn diaper package was a thunderclap in her ears. A professional thief feels nothing. Clara felt everything. She felt the searing shame, the crushing desperation, and the overwhelming, ferocious love that drove her to this point. With clumsy, panicked movements, she slipped the 2 items into her worn fabric bag. This wasn't a crime of greed. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to build a nest. For one fragile second, she allowed herself to imagine a clean, warm room where she could use them, and that fleeting vision of maternal care was all the justification she needed. A hand, heavy and firm, clamped down on her shoulder. "And where do you think you're going with that?" The security guard's voice was a low growl, thick with accusation. The warmth of the store evaporated instantly, replaced by an icy dread that flooded Clara's veins. The man's eyes weren't on her face. They were fixed on the unnatural bulge in her bag. He didn't see the exhaustion etched into her young features or the advanced swell of her pregnancy. He saw a liability, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and efficiently. To him, she was just another piece of city refuse that had blown in through the doors, and his job was to sweep her out. The world, which had been a hopeful blur, snapped back into sharp, cruel focus. "You're coming with me," he commanded, giving her arm a rough tug. Weakened by hunger and thrown off balance, Clara stumbled. The guard's shove was one of casual impatience, not outright malice, but for a woman in her delicate condition, the effect was catastrophic. Her feet tangled beneath her. The world tilted sideways in a horrifying, slow-motion arc. A few shoppers gasped, the sound distant and distorted. Then came the hard, unforgiving impact with the polished floor. A sharp pain shot through her hip, but it was nothing compared to the terror that seized her heart. Instinctively, her arms wrapped around her belly, her body curling into a protective shield. She lay broken on the cold linoleum, a mother's first and most primal duty, her only thought. The silence that followed was broken not by an offer of help, but by the poison of judgment. "A thief," one woman whispered to her husband, steering her cart away as if poverty were a contagion. "Right in front of everyone," another scoffed, shaking her head with performative disgust. The verdict was instantaneous and unanimous. They saw a simple story, a criminal caught in the act. No one knelt down. No one asked if she or the baby were all right. They were merely spectators at a public shaming, their faces a cold gallery of contempt and morbid curiosity. Clara felt their stares like 1,000 tiny needles, each one piercing the last remnants of her dignity, leaving her soul exposed and shivering on the floor. Then the phones appeared. Small, glowing rectangles were lifted from pockets and purses, their lenses aimed at her. They were not calling for an ambulance. They were recording her agony. The unblinking red light of a camera felt like a brand on her skin, searing her humiliation into permanence. She was no longer a human being in crisis. She was content, a shocking clip to be shared and commented on by strangers. Her most vulnerable moment was becoming entertainment. The guard stood over her, arms crossed, a silent ringmaster, letting the crowd feast on her despair. The shame was a physical force, a suffocating heat that made it impossible to breathe. She wished the floor would swallow her whole. In their minds, her story was simple and self-inflicted. She was a leech, a drain on society, probably stealing to feed a habit. This is what those people did. Their silent condemnation was a shield, protecting them from the uncomfortable truth of her existence, keeping their own fragile security intact. To help her would be to condone her actions. To question the situation would require an empathy they were unwilling to spend. It was far easier to stand back and judge, reinforcing the invisible wall that separated their world from hers. By watching her fall, they felt more stable on their own 2 feet, their righteousness affirmed by her degradation. Clara didn't cry out. She didn't beg or plead for mercy. A profound, crushing silence enveloped her, drowning out the whispers and the guard's impatient sighs. Her entire world had contracted to the precious, sacred space within her own body. A tiny foot fluttered against her ribs, a secret pawn pulsing reminder of life in the midst of her social death. She closed her eyes, shutting out the ring of hostile faces. The world could label her a thief, a failure, a ghost. It could film her, hate her, and discard her. But in that single, eternal moment on the cold floor, she was not a criminal. She was a fortress, and she would protect her child from the cruelty of a world that refused to see her. Through the same automatic doors Clara had entered like a wraith, Adrian Cole strode in like a king surveying his domain. At 45, he wore his wealth like a suit of armor, an impeccably tailored dark suit, a watch worth more than a car, and an expression of profound, impenetrable boredom. He was in the market for a single, obscenely expensive bottle of wine, a perfunctory purchase for a business dinner he had no desire to attend. The world for him was a series of obligations to be met and obstacles to be navigated with minimal emotional expenditure. He moved with a purpose that tolerated no delays. His polished leather shoes clicking a rhythm of impatience on the gleaming floor, a man utterly detached from the mundane humanity that surrounded him. The commotion near aisle 7 registered first as an annoyance, a vulgar disruption in the store's carefully curated atmosphere of calm abundance. He saw the cluster of shoppers, the officious security guard, and something crumpled on the floor. His mind, trained to assess and dismiss, categorized the scene in a fraction of a second. A shoplifter, a scene, a problem for someone else to solve. His first instinct was to bypass it entirely, to maintain the sterile bubble in which he lived. His face, a mask of cold neutrality, betrayed nothing, but internally, a familiar disdain churned. This was the city's grime, the social static he paid a fortune to insulate himself from, and it had dared to seep into his path. He was forced to stop. The gawking crowd blocked his direct route to the wine selection. With a sigh of irritation, he stood at the edge of the circle, his gaze falling upon the woman on the floor. He didn't see a person, he saw a cliché. Disheveled clothes, tangled hair, the desperate posture of the defeated. He registered the guard's self-important stance and the murmurs of the onlookers. His mind supplied the narrative for them. Another delinquent making poor life choices and expecting the world to clean up the mess. The judgment was swift, clinical, and absolute. It was a defense mechanism he had perfected over a decade, a way to keep the world's messy, unpredictable pain at a safe and manageable distance from his own scarred heart. The whispers of the crowd confirmed his bias. "Thief," a man muttered, pulling his child closer. "Ought to be ashamed," a woman added, her phone held high to capture the spectacle. Adrian felt a grim sense of validation. The world was orderly, and this woman had violated its rules. His philosophy was simple: you reap what you sow. He had built an empire from nothing, he told himself, through discipline and a refusal to make excuses. This woman on the floor was the antithesis of everything he stood for. He felt no empathy, only a cold, hard certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Indifference was his shield, and he raised it high, preparing to turn and walk away from the unpleasantness. Just as he was about to pivot, his eyes caught a detail he had initially missed. It wasn't just the woman's ragged coat or the shame on her face. It was the distinct, undeniable curve of her belly beneath the thin fabric. She was pregnant. The observation didn't soften him, it hardened him further. A pregnant thief was, in his mind, an even greater failure. It was an act of supreme irresponsibility, bringing a child into a life of chaos she had created for herself. The sight did not trigger compassion, but instead ignited a cold, controlled anger. He saw it as a weakness, perhaps even a tactic for sympathy. He had no sympathy to give. The world had taken all of it from him long ago. The image, however, was a key turning a lock he had thought rusted shut. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the scene in front of him blurred, replaced by a memory he kept buried under layers of work and solitude. His wife, 10 years ago, her hand resting on her own swollen belly, her face radiant with a hope he could no longer comprehend. The ghost of that memory was an electric shock, a jolt of pure, undiluted pain. He blinked hard, forcing the image away, shoving it back down into the darkness where it belonged. His jaw tightened. The cold mask he wore was not just an expression, it was a cage, and for a moment, the ghost of his past had rattled its bars. He fought the feeling with brutal logic. This woman was not his wife, her situation was not his tragedy, his pain was his own, a private monument of grief that no one else was allowed to touch or even acknowledge. To feel anything for this stranger would be a betrayal of that grief, a crack in the foundation of the empty life he had so carefully constructed. He reinforced the walls around his heart, layering them with scorn and judgment. She was a problem. She was a statistic. She was a messy, inconvenient reminder of a life he had lost and a future that had been stolen from him. He would not let her pathetic drama breach his defenses. And so he stood there, a statue of wealth and power, frozen on the edge of another person's rock bottom. The two worlds had collided in the sterile aisle of a grocery store. Hers, a world of desperation, hunger, and a fierce, protective love for a life not yet born. His, a world of gilded emptiness, profound loss, and a heart sealed in ice. He was the antagonist in her story, the embodiment of the cold, indifferent system that was crushing her. But in that moment, as he stared at the pregnant woman on the floor, he was unknowingly staring into a mirror reflecting his own deepest wound. The encounter was a spark in a tinderbox of buried sorrow, and an explosion was imminent. The echo of Adrian's shout, "Enough!" hung in the air like shattered glass, silencing the whispers and freezing the scene in place. The security guard flinched, his authority instantly nullified by a voice that dripped with command and something far more volatile: pain. Adrian himself seemed surprised by the force of his own eruption, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he stared at the woman on the floor. For a disorienting moment, he wasn't a real estate magnate in a grocery store. He was a man standing on the precipice of a 10-year-old wound that had been violently torn open. He saw Clara, but his soul saw the ghost of his wife, and the collision of past and present left him breathless, angry, and terrifyingly exposed. His composure returned as a reflex, a cold mask sliding back into place. He strode forward, not with kindness, but with the brutal efficiency of a man solving a logistical problem. He pulled a black credit card from his wallet and thrust it at the stunned store manager who had scurried over. "Ring this up," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of the earlier emotion, "and tell your man to back away from her. Now." The transaction was a shield, an attempt to sanitize the raw moment with the sterile balm of money. He wasn't helping, he was containing a mess, paying to make the uncomfortable reality of her suffering disappear, so he could retreat back into his fortress of solitude without this image haunting him. Clara watched his movements through a haze of shock and pain. When he extended a hand to help her up, she recoiled as if his touch might burn her. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. This was not a rescue, it was a transaction of power. He was not an ally, he was a wealthier, more imposing version of the men who had discarded her. Using the edge of a shelf for support, she struggled to her feet alone, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Her silence was a wall, her refusal a desperate act of defiance. Accepting his help would mean admitting she was a charity case, a broken thing to be pitied and then forgotten. She had lost everything, but she would not surrender her last shred of dignity. The store manager, a man skilled in the art of appeasing the wealthy, bowed slightly to Adrian while casting a venomous glare at Clara. "Sir, I assure you, we were handling it. We were just about to call the police to have her removed." The words were meant to reassure Adrian, but they only highlighted the chasm between their worlds. To the manager, Adrian was a valued patron to be protected. Clara was refused to be swept away. The threat of police hung in the air, a tool of the system designed to keep people like her invisible and in their place. Adrian felt a familiar wave of irritation. This was precisely the kind of messy, complicated human drama he had spent a decade avoiding. He turned back to Clara, his patience wearing thin. The raw empathy from moments before was already being paved over by his usual pragmatism. "I'm taking you out of here," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was not an offer, but a declaration. He was moving a chess piece off a board he found distasteful. He saw her defiance, the untamed pride in her eyes, and it grated on him. In his world, problems were solved with directives and money, not with emotional appeals. He needed to get her out of the public eye, out of his line of sight, before the crack in his own armor widened into a chasm he could not control. Her very presence was a threat to his carefully maintained emptiness. For the first time, Clara spoke, her voice a raw whisper that carried the weight of her exhaustion and resolve. "Leave me alone." She looked directly at him, and for a second he saw not a victim, but a warrior. "I don't want your help. I don't want anything from you." Each word was a shield she raised against him. She would rather face the cold indifference of a jail cell than the ambiguous charity of a man who looked at her as if she were an inconvenience he had to manage. She had learned the hard way that help from powerful men always came with a price, and it was a debt she was no longer willing to pay. Her freedom, even on the streets, was worth more than his gilded pity. Her resistance ignited a cold fire of frustration in Adrian. It was illogical. It was ungrateful. He had intervened, stopped her public humiliation, and now she was rejecting his solution. His cynical mind, his oldest and most trusted companion, began to whisper poisonous theories. Was this a negotiation? A ploy to extract more from him? He was accustomed to people wanting his money, not refusing it. Her pride was an alien concept in the transactional world he inhabited. Yet beneath the anger, a flicker of something else stirred, a reluctant admiration. He had built his empire on an unbending will, and he recognized the same steel in her, even if it was forged in desperation rather than ambition. The security guard, emboldened by Adrian's visible frustration, stepped forward again. "See, I told you she was trouble, sir. People like this, they don't want help. It's best to just let us call it in and let the authorities handle it." The guard's words were a siren call back to Adrian's old life, an invitation to wash his hands of the entire affair and retreat. It was the easy path, the logical one. He could walk away right now, get his bottle of wine, and forget he ever saw her face. It was what the old Adrian, the man he had been for 10 long years, would have done without a second thought. He could let the system swallow her, and his world would return to its quiet, orderly state. But his gaze fell from Clara's defiant eyes to the bag on the floor, the can of formula, and the package of diapers peeking out. He remembered her whispered words to her unborn child, a desperate promise made in the depths of hell. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about his discomfort or her pride. It was about the innocent life she was fighting for. The thought cut through his anger like a surgeon's scalpel. He let out a slow, controlled breath, his tone shifting from command to something harder to define, a statement of irrefutable fact. "You fell. You're pregnant. You need to be seen by a doctor. This isn't a negotiation. It's a medical necessity." Clara flinched at the word doctor. It conjured images of bills she couldn't pay and judgments she couldn't bear. Yet the mention of her baby was a key that unlocked her deepest fear. What if the fall had hurt the child? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart, colder and sharper than any public humiliation. She looked at this stranger, this cold, imposing man, and saw not a savior, but a means to an end. Her own safety meant nothing, but her child's was everything. The fierce battle between her pride and her maternal terror raged in the silence. Finally, with a barely perceptible movement, she gave a single, stiff nod. It wasn't trust. It wasn't gratitude. It was a mother's terrified temporary truce with a world she did not understand. The ride to the hospital was a study in suffocating silence. Adrian's luxury sedan glided through the city's glittering veins, a hermetically sealed bubble of leather and quiet power. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words. Clara pressed herself against the passenger door, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if proximity to his wealth might contaminate her further. She watched the rain-slicked streets blur past, each streetlight a fleeting star in her dark universe. To Adrian, who drove with a grim, mechanical precision, she was a task on his checklist, an unforeseen variable disrupting a carefully planned evening. He was calculating the quickest way to resolve this situation, while she was calculating the first opportunity to escape a kindness that felt more like a cage. They arrived not at a public clinic, but at the gleaming, sterile entrance of a private medical center, a place so clean it seemed to reject the very idea of poverty. Adrian's power was a key that unlocked every door. He didn't ask, he commanded. His name, spoken with quiet authority to the front desk staff, was a password that bypassed queues and paperwork. "Take care of everything. Bill my private account," he ordered, the words clipped and impersonal. He was sanitizing the encounter with money, treating Clara's well-being as a corporate acquisition. For Clara, this efficiency was a new form of violence. She was no longer a person in crisis, but a problem being outsourced, a liability being managed by a man who couldn't bear to get his own hands dirty. A nurse with a practiced, gentle smile led Clara to an examination room. The crispness of the sheets on the bed, the soft hum of the machines, the very air itself felt like it belonged to another species of human. Adrian remained in the hallway, his back to her door, pacing like a caged panther. He checked the time on his platinum watch, the minutes ticking away toward a business dinner he now knew he would miss. A familiar irritation gnawed at him. He had done his part. He had paid. He just needed the doctor's confirmation that the situation was contained so he could deposit her at a shelter and erase this entire messy episode from his memory. He was not a savior. He was a problem solver, and this problem was taking far too long. Inside the room, as the nurse helped Clara onto the bed, her worn coat fell open. A small, crumpled piece of paper fluttered from her pocket and landed on the polished floor. It was her ultrasound photo. Clara gasped, a sound of pure panic, and scrambled to retrieve it before anyone else could touch it. She clutched the fragile image to her chest, her knuckles white. The nurse watched the raw, desperate gesture with a flicker of understanding. In this world of sterile equipment and professional detachment, that flimsy photograph was the only real thing in the room. It was not a medical document, it was a testament, a promise, the last surviving artifact of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. It was all she had. The doctor, a calm, professional man, emerged to give Adrian the report. The baby's heartbeat is strong, but she's suffering from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. She can't go back on the street in this condition. Adrian listened with a detached nod, his mind already formulating the next step, a donation to a women's shelter, a clean and final transaction. He followed the doctor back into the room, intending to deliver his verdict, to finalize the arrangement, and close the file on Clara Evans. He entered with the same cold, executive aura he had worn in the grocery store, ready to issue his final instructions and walk away forever. His emotional armor was polished and firmly in place, deflecting the uncomfortable reality of her life. But he stopped dead just inside the doorway. He saw Clara, sitting on the edge of the bed, oblivious to his presence. She was staring at the wrinkled ultrasound photo in her hand, her thumb gently stroking the grainy image of a life no one else seemed to value. Her voice was a barely audible whisper. Her secret meant only for the child she carried, a sound not intended for any other ear. "I'm so sorry, my little one," she breathed, her voice cracking with a love so profound it was painful. "Mommy just wanted to have something ready for you." It was not a plea for pity or a performance of despair. It was the purest and most heartbroken confession a mother could make. The words did not enter Adrian's ears. They detonated in his soul. The sterile white room, the doctor, the beeping machines, it all dissolved into a blinding white light of memory. He was no longer in a hospital. He was standing in a sun-drenched nursery he had built with his own hands 10 years ago, watching his wife, Eleanor, her face radiant, holding their own ultrasound photo with that same sacred reverence. He could hear her laughter, feel the phantom warmth of her hand on his arm as she whispered promises of love and safety to their unborn son. The grief he had buried under a decade of steel and concrete erupted, a tidal wave of pure, undiluted agony that ripped the air from his lungs and left him gasping. The doctor turned, startled, as Adrian staggered back against the doorframe, his hand gripping the wood for support. The mask of cold control was gone, shattered. In its place was the face of a man drowning in a sorrow so deep it was terrifying to witness. A single, hot tear broke free and traced a path through his stoic facade, a silent testament to a pain he had refused to acknowledge for 3,650 days. He was no longer looking at a problem to be solved. He was looking at a ghost. He saw Clara, a woman fighting for her child against impossible odds, and in her, he saw the reflection of the love he had lost and the father he never got to be. "Mr. Cole, are you all right?" the doctor asked, taking a hesitant step toward him. Adrian didn't hear him. His universe had contracted to the woman on the bed. He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a shaky, uncertain step into the room. The power, the arrogance, the icy distance, it had all been burned away, leaving only a raw, shocking vulnerability. He walked past Clara, not looking at her, and went to the small side table. He picked up the plastic cup of water the nurse had left there. His hand was trembling as he turned and held it out to her. It was not an order. It was not charity. It was a silent, desperate offering from one broken heart to another. Clara looked up, her own fear and confusion momentarily suspended by the sight of him. She saw the anguish in his eyes, a depth of pain that mirrored her own despair. In that moment, he was not a rich man, and she was not a poor woman. They were simply two people who had lost everything that mattered. The vast chasm that had separated them vanished, replaced by a fragile, unspoken bridge of shared humanity. Slowly, hesitantly, She reached out and took the cup. Her fingers brushed against his, and the brief, simple contact was more powerful than any word. The judgment was gone. The anger was gone. And in the sterile silence of the hospital room, something new and fragile began to grow in its place. The silence in the hospital room stretched thin, fragile as old lace. Adrian finally broke it, his voice no longer the sharp instrument of command it once was, but something rougher, more human. "I have a place," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "An apartment. It's not far from here. It's empty." He didn't look at her, focusing instead on a fixed point on the opposite wall, as if the memory of the space was too painful to face directly. This wasn't a business proposition, it was a confession. He was offering her not just shelter, but a piece of his own history, a sanctuary he had locked away with his grief. For Clara, the offer was incomprehensible, a life raft appearing in a desert. She stared at him, her mind racing, searching for the angle, the hidden price tag on this impossible act of kindness. Clara's first instinct was to run. She slid off the examination bed, her bare feet cold on the linoleum, a silent declaration of her intent to leave. "Why?" she asked, her voice a low, steady whisper that held the steely resolve of someone who had learned to expect nothing. "I am not a charity case for you to feel better about yourself. I don't want your pity." Her words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, a boundary drawn by a lifetime of disappointments. Every helping hand she had ever been offered had eventually closed into a fist or let her go. She would rather face the known cruelty of the streets than the unknown debt of a rich man's conscience. Her dignity was the only home she had left, and she would not trade it for 4 walls and a roof. Adrian didn't try to stop her, but his next words did. "The apartment, it was for my son." The admission hung in the sterile air, heavy with a decade of unshed tears. He finally met her gaze, his eyes stripped of all their armor, revealing a wound as deep and raw as her own. "My wife and I, Jesus, we never got to bring him home." He swallowed hard, the simple act looking like a monumental effort. "It's been sitting empty ever since. A ghost house. Maybe it's time it held a new life instead of just an old memory." "This isn't about pity, Clara. This is about letting some light into a place that's been dark for too long, maybe for both of us." He wasn't offering to save her. He was asking her to help save him. His devastating honesty shattered her defenses. In his broken confession, she heard an echo of her own deepest fear, the terror of a future stolen before it could begin. He wasn't a powerful millionaire looking down on her. He was a fellow survivor, a man marooned on his own island of grief. The chasm between their worlds vanished, replaced by the fragile bridge of a shared, unspoken sorrow. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a profound, weary acceptance. She gave a single, slow nod, a silent truce. Later, standing before a quiet apartment door, he placed a single key in her palm. Its metallic weight felt solid, real. It wasn't a gift, it was an understanding, a chance to begin again, offered by someone who knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything. Adrian did not step inside. He remained on the threshold, a silent guardian, granting her the sanctity of her new space. Clara entered alone, her worn shoes making no sound on the clean house-polished floors. The air was still, holding the faint, sad scent of a place that had been waiting. She walked not to the small kitchen or the furnished bedroom, but straight to the large window that overlooked a quiet, tree-lined street. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching the world go on without judging her. Then, with infinite care, she reached into her pocket, withdrew the crumpled ultrasound photo, and gently smoothed it out on the sunlit windowsill. It was the first thing she owned that had a proper place. It wasn't a happy ending, it was a safe beginning. 3 months later, the city's indifferent hum was a lullaby. The woman who had once slept on its cold concrete now stood bathed in the warm morning light of a quiet apartment, a home that had learned to breathe again. Clara Evans was gone, replaced by a mother whose strength was no longer born of desperation, but of a deep, quiet joy. She held her son, Liam, his tiny body a warm, solid weight against her chest, a living testament to a promise she had managed to keep. The world was no longer a battlefield, it was a nursery. The apartment, once a silent monument to a ghost, was now filled with the soft sounds of a new life. Gurgles, sighs, and the steady, rhythmic beat of two hearts that had found their safe harbor. Adrian Cole visited not with the stiff obligation of a benefactor, but with the quiet reverence of a pilgrim. The 10 years of self-imposed winter in his soul had begun to thaw. He rarely spoke of his past, but it was no longer a phantom that haunted his every step. He would stand by the window, watching Clara rock her son, and the hard lines around his eyes would soften. The armor of wealth and power had been set aside, revealing the man underneath, one who was learning, hesitantly, to feel again. He wasn't trying to replace the son he had lost. He was honoring his memory by allowing a new life to flourish in the empty space his grief had carved out. He was no longer just a millionaire. He was a witness to a miracle he never believed he would see again. One afternoon, he arrived with a small, unvarnished wooden bird in his hand. It was simple, handmade, a stark contrast to the world of luxury he inhabited. It was supposed to be for his mobile, Adrian said, his voice quiet, the words a difficult offering. Clara took it from him, her fingers brushing his. There was no pity in her eyes, only a profound, shared understanding. "Liam will love it," she said softly, her gratitude a gentle warmth that asked for nothing more. Their conversations were like this, brief, honest, and built on the foundation of their shared scars. They were two survivors learning to speak a new language, not of pain but of a fragile's emerging hope. If you believe everyone deserves a chance to build a new future, share this story. So many people are fighting silent battles just like this. The true turning point came not with words, but with a touch. As Adrian stood near the crib, his gaze lost in a sea of memory, Liam awoke. He didn't cry. His small, unfocused eyes blinked up at the tall figure, and with an instinct that knew nothing of wealth or loss, he stretched out a tiny hand. His fingers, impossibly small, curled around Adrian's index finger, a firm, trusting grip. For Adrian, the contact was an earthquake. It was not a memory of what he had lost, but a tangible, living connection to what could still be found. A single tear, the twin to the one he shed in the hospital, traced a path down his cheek. But this was not a tear of grief. It was a tear of release. They stood together at the window that evening, the city lights beginning to sparkle below. Clara held Liam, who was now sleeping soundly, and Adrian stood beside them, a quiet guardian. He was no longer looking at a reflection of his own tragedy, but at a portrait of resilience. He had offered her a sanctuary from the world, but she, in her quiet dignity and fierce love, had offered him a far greater gift, a sanctuary from himself. The ghost of his wife, Eleanor, no longer felt like an agonizing absence but a gentle presence, a whisper of approval on the evening breeze. He had finally let some light into the dark room of his heart. Do you believe in second chances? Let us know in the comments below. Your story of hope matters. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. No grand speeches were necessary. He simply looked at Clara, at the new life she cradled, and saw the future. "Thank you, Clara," he said, and the words held the weight of a decade of unspoken gratitude. She smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. "No, Adrian, thank you." After the door clicked shut, she walked over to a small table and picked up the single key he had given her. It no longer felt like a piece of metal that opened a lock. It was a symbol of a promise kept, a life reborn. He had given her a home to protect her from the world, but she and her son had given him a reason to live in it again.